Hello, I'm Milan Czerwiński and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. The Summer Olympics has begun in Paris, but when has the Olympics not been about politics? When has it not been about security? That is a major question. Probably mostly about to what extent we can say that these principles actually apply to the current edition. And for that, and also many other topics, we've invited our very own TVP World Sports Reporter, Jon Carter. Hello and welcome.
Good morning, Jonas.
So let us begin with those political and security issues. I mean, would you say that the current edition of the Olympics is any different to what we've experienced during the last couple of decades, really? Because in many cases, of course, there is plenty of excitement concerning the exploits of individual athletes. But in the background, it is very often very much about major political powers vying for attention.
Yeah, well, first of all, on the kind of geopolitical arena, of course, Russia and Belarus obviously stand out, having had many athletes banned from entering, and actually they'll be competing under a neutral flag, so they won't actually be competing under their own flag. And a couple of weeks ago, Russia television networks announced that they wouldn't be broadcasting the games because they were largely insignificant to them now that they had so few athletes competing and only in non-prestigious events.
They apparently organized their own competitive events, so to say, and this prompted many commentators to say, look, we know how it's going to be. It's going to be Russia is the champion of Russia. And, quite unsurprisingly.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the interesting thing, because you said, how does it differ from recent decades? Well, I think, the issue with geopolitics in the Olympics is certainly nothing new. I mean, if we go back to the 1980s, we had a situation where, the Americans and 60 odd allies of the Americans withdrew from the Moscow Games in 1980. And then in a supposed tit for tat, the Soviet Union and other Soviet Union allies withdrew from the 1984 Los Angeles Games. So, I mean, yeah, this is certainly nothing new. With reference to the security and the heightened security around this, I would say this is something a little bit different. It is new. I was looking at the figures in terms of security for these games, and to be honest, I was quite shocked with the amount of security and the security level in comparison to more recent games. And today will be the opening ceremony, and there are 45,000 police and security service officers, agents, whichever, who will be in attendance at this afternoon's opening ceremony, which I think is an incredible number. Just for reference, I was looking at, I know it's going back a few years, but the 2012 London Olympics. Bear in mind, sort of terrorism and the heightened security around that was quite rife. But we were talking about a few thousand for the opening ceremony, etc. So there are many factors involved here. There's obviously questions about the terrorism itself, and even in the run-up to these games, there have been a lot of crime incidents going on in Paris. There have been robberies, sexual assaults. There have been attacks on people working for TV networks. There have been robberies of Australian cyclists. An executive from a corporation had his bag stolen at a hotel. And the Argentina-Morocco match yesterday took 4.5 hours to complete because people kept running onto the pitch, and the Moroccan fans were throwing things at the French players. The Argentinian players have had jewelry stolen during their training sessions. I mean, I could go on. this is going to be a real test for the French, the security. And, if we're talking about the Olympics, let's be honest, it is, and you want to put it into a political context, it's largely a PR exercise.
Well, it is truly remarkable. I mean, the figures that you've given, especially since right now we're mostly focusing on geopolitical threats. We're focusing, for a good reason, on the war in Ukraine. But back then, like 2012, I mean, that was the very apex of the, the focus on global terrorism, on extremist groups possibly plotting some sort of attack against a major site, such as, for example, a stadium filled to the brim with people. And this was very much the focus. So if the security measures have been elevated since then, even though we don't seem to talk that much about global terrorism nowadays, I mean, that is surely telling something. But let me just ask you one more question related to the Russian athletes situation. Would you say that this has been this sort of compromise that kept nobody satisfied, really? Because you've already mentioned Russia basically saying, okay, we're cutting our coverage because we don't really care. I mean, our athletes are not really representing the whole, propaganda machinery, and we know that they would have exploited this. But also the fact that they are still able to compete, albeit with no Russian flag in sight, this has prompted many protests. People saying, look, you're still allowing them to be there. And what if some of them were members of the armed forces that were committing war crimes in Ukraine? So it's like nobody really is satisfied with this option. Wouldn't it have been better to ban them outright, as some groups have been advocating for from the very start?
Well, yeah, that's a tricky question to answer. I take your point though, definitely with does it really satisfy anyone? Probably not, and it seems a little bit, what's the point? You have 14 athletes from Russia, none of them competing in anything particularly significant, and not being able to do it under their own flag. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, but on the sort of broader aspect of this, I suppose there's a fair point to say, if we, if we do take the stance, right, no Russian athletes allowed in these games, we have to set the tone, and what they've been doing on an international stage is unacceptable, and therefore, we have to draw the line here. Well, I think, you could make the same point with Israel. And yet there's been absolutely no difference in preventing their athletes from competing. So I kind of feel, if we're going to draw a line here with who can and who cannot compete according to what their countries are doing on the battlefield, and war crimes and what have you, then I think it needs to be across the board, and it needs to be consistent. Whereas at the moment it's not, and yeah, this is also one of the security issues as well, that we touched on earlier. There was the other day, Israel and Mali, I think, were playing a football match, obviously in France for one of the first games. And people were trying to attack Israeli fans there. And, so this is
So these tensions are spilling
issue.
over, right? I mean, it is hard to compare one war with the other, given that Russia has committed an act of unprovoked aggression. Still, it is a valid point. The number of casualties in the Gaza Strip, approaching 40,000 people. I mean, this is hardly acceptable, and especially if the Olympics are supposed to be a symbol of peace. It is obvious that some people are going to take exception. Now, let me ask you one final question. As for Polish fans, what disciplines do they actually have to look forward to, in particular during these next few days?
Right. Well, the obvious ones to mention, of course, is Iga Swiatek. She is red hot favourite for gold in the women's tennis. For Swiatek, this is a great opportunity because she's playing at Roland Garros in Paris. This on clay, so it's her favourite surface in a place where she's won the last 3 French Opens in a row. So I mean, and I would say her biggest competitor, Sabalenka, has also withdrawn. So she is looking very good for gold there. Elsewhere, men's volleyball. Many people have been talking about the quarterfinal curse. Incredibly, Poland has reached the quarterfinals of the last 6 Olympic Games and been knocked out at that stage each time. It really is phenomenal. This time, they are the world's #1 ranked team. They won the Nations League last year, the European Championships. They really are looking good, and I'd be amazed if they don't make it beyond the quarterfinals this time. Elsewhere, I think a more niche event perhaps, but certainly a Polish favourite for gold, and one to look out for is Alexandra Mirosław. Now, Mirosław only came 4th in the Tokyo Games a couple of years back, but she has set the world record on numerous occasions, and I'd be stunned if she doesn't make it onto the podium. And in fact, I'd say she's probably a favourite for gold. We should also mention Alexandra Kawucka, who is also a good bet for gold in the same discipline. One of the main things, though, is actually Polish athletes on the water. So we've got several different disciplines that we could discuss. We've got the canoeing. At the centerpiece of the kind of canoeing is Karolina Naya, and she'll be in the K2 500 with Puławska. And then
so hopefully they will make a splash. Unfortunately, just as the water flows, so does the time here on TVP World. So for the time being, at least, we're going to have to park our conversation there. Jon Carter, our TVP World Sports Reporter, was here with all the details about the Olympics. Jon, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I'm Milan Śrewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us for more latest news and updates.